Atlas had passed every test they gave him, but when graduation ended, he refused the simplest command of all: leave. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Marine Corps K-9 training field, turning the chain-link fences gold and stretching long shadows across the packed dirt. Folding chairs scraped against concrete as families gathered certificates. Instructors shook hands, and handlers led their newly graduated dogs toward waiting vehicles. The air smelled of warm grass, leather leads, and dust baked beneath a California sky. Somewhere beyond the kennels, a flag rope tapped softly against a metal pole. Caleb Rowe stood near the edge of the field with Atlas beside him, one hand resting against the German shepherd's thick sable neck. Caleb was a white Marine in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and disciplined, with close-cropped brown hair and pale blue eyes that rarely revealed more than he intended. A silver graduation tag hung from Atlas's collar, catching the light each time the dog breathed. "You did good, partner," Caleb said quietly. Atlas looked up at him, amber eyes steady. For 8 months, they had trained together through cold mornings, summer heat, failed drills, and small victories no ceremony could measure. Atlas had learned hand signals, scent patterns, obstacle routes, and the difference between danger and fear. Caleb had learned something harder. He had learned how to trust a living soul beside him again. But tomorrow morning, Atlas would be transferred to another unit. The paperwork was signed. The decision was final. Caleb told himself that was the job. Train them well. Let them go. Never ask what the empty space would feel like afterward. Captain Harris called from near the parking lot. "Row, transport leaves at 1600. Caleb raised one hand in acknowledgement, then clipped the lead to Atlas's collar. "All right, buddy. Heel." He stepped forward. The lead tightened. Atlas did not move. Caleb stopped and glanced back. The dog remained seated in the center of the field, ears forward, gaze fixed somewhere beyond Caleb's shoulder. "Atlas. Heel." Nothing. Around them, the last voices faded. A truck door slammed. An engine started, then rolled away, leaving the field strangely quiet. Caleb returned to Atlas and checked his paws, his collar, his breathing. Everything appeared normal. "What is it?" he murmured. Atlas turned his head toward the far end of the field. Beyond the obstacle wall stood Lane 7, an old training course closed since Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Mercer died months earlier. Its wooden markers leaned beneath the wind. Weeds had grown through the tire path. A faded red flag still hung from the final post, pale as an old memory. Caleb felt his hand tighten around the lead. "No," he whispered, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to Atlas or himself. He gave the command one final time. Atlas rose at once, but instead of walking toward the parking lot, he took 3 slow steps toward Lane 7. Then he stopped and looked back. Caleb remained still. Atlas stepped forward again, waited, and looked over his shoulder. In that moment, Caleb understood something that made the empty field feel even quieter. Atlas was not refusing to leave. He was asking Caleb to follow. Caleb did not move at first. The evening wind crossed the field in a slow breath, carrying the dry scent of grass and the faint metallic warmth of the obstacle rails. Atlas stood 10 feet ahead, body still, ears lifted toward Lane 7. The dog did not pull against the lead. He simply waited. Caleb had seen that posture before. It was not defiance. It was certainty. "You know that course is closed," Caleb said, his voice low enough that the words seemed meant only for the two of them. Atlas turned his head toward him, then looked back at the faded red flag. Caleb followed his gaze. Beyond the first wooden marker, the lane narrowed between old tires, low platforms, and weathered posts that had not been used since winter. The place had been left untouched after Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Mercer died, as if no one had been willing to decide what should happen to the ground, where he had spent so many mornings teaching Marines how to listen without speaking. Caleb remembered Mercer standing there with a silver whistle between his teeth, one hand raised, his voice calm even when everyone else was frustrated. "A good handler does not force an answer," Mercer used to say. "He notices the question." Caleb looked down at Atlas. "Is that what this is?" Atlas stepped forward. The lead loosened, then tightened again as Caleb remained in place. For a moment, Caleb considered turning back. The transport officer would be waiting. The kennels would need final paperwork. There were rules for endings, and Caleb had always trusted rules more than feelings. Rules told a man where to stand, when to speak, and what to carry. They did not ask what he would miss. They did not ask why he had signed Atlas away without making a single objection. Caleb had told himself that another unit needed a dog like Atlas. He had told himself that attachment could cloud judgment. He had told himself many things that sounded disciplined and felt empty. The truth was harder. Every good thing Caleb had ever loved had eventually become something he feared losing, so he had learned to step away first. Atlas had been different from the beginning. On their first morning together, the German Shepherd had ignored the offered treat and pressed his nose against Caleb's closed fist instead. Caleb had been holding Mercer's old training coin in his palm, rubbing its worn edge without realizing it. Atlas had stayed there until Caleb opened his hand. Since then, the dog had noticed every silence Caleb tried to hide inside. The sleepless mornings. The crowded rooms he left too early. The way his right hand tightened whenever someone mentioned deployment. Atlas never demanded an explanation. He only moved closer. Now the field behind them was nearly empty. The last transport truck disappeared beyond the gate, and the sound of its engine faded into the distance. Caleb looked toward the parking lot, then toward lane 7. Atlas took one more step and stopped beside the first marker. His amber eyes met Caleb's with a patience that felt almost painful. Caleb let out a slow breath. "All right," he said. "Show me." The moment the words left him, Atlas turned and entered the abandoned lane, not running, not searching wildly, but moving with the careful purpose of a dog following a lesson he had never forgotten. Lane 7 received them in silence. The grass along its edges had grown nearly a foot high, brushing against Caleb's boots as he followed Atlas past the weathered entrance post. Dust lay undisturbed across the old course, except for the narrow path opening beneath the dog's paws. The evening light had softened to amber, turning every rope, platform, and faded marker into something half-remembered. Atlas moved with his nose low but not searching for scent. He was following sequence. At the first wooden post, he stopped and touched it with his shoulder. Caleb recognized the motion immediately. It belonged to an early navigation drill Mercer had taught before Atlas understood hand signals. Touch the first marker. Confirm direction. Wait for the handler. Caleb raised his hand without thinking. Forward. Atlas continued. He passed the second post without touching it, though the standard course required contact at every marker. Caleb frowned. Atlas, mark. The dog ignored the command and walked on. At the third post, he lowered himself onto the dirt, front paws straight, head raised toward the observation tower at the far end of the lane. Caleb felt something cold move through him despite the warmth of the evening. First post. Skip the second. Down at the third. Look high. The pattern pressed against a place in his memory that had remained closed for months. Mercer had called it the return pattern. He had taught it during a week when storms damaged the base communication system and handlers practiced moving without radios. Caleb remembered standing in this same lane while Mercer drew 4 lines in the dirt with the tip of his boot. Most people think training is about sending a dog forward, he had said. Sometimes the most important command is the one that brings both of you back. Caleb had asked where the pattern led. Mercer had smiled, tapped the silver whistle hanging from his neck, and said, "You will know when you need it." No one had used the drill after that week. It never appeared in the official handbook. Caleb had nearly convinced himself he remembered it wrong. Atlas rose and continued toward the tower. The lead remained loose between them. He did not glance at the obstacles on either side. He ignored the low wall, the tunnel, and the suspended bridge that had once been his favorite exercise. His attention remained fixed on the same distant point. Caleb followed more slowly now, listening to the faint creak of wood in the wind. Near the middle of the lane, Atlas stopped beside an old bench where Mercer used to sit during breaks. The dog lowered his nose to the seat, inhaled once, then turned and pressed his muzzle against Caleb's right hand. Caleb looked down. His fingers had curled into a fist. He opened them. Atlas moved on. 20 feet later, he paused beside the fence where Caleb had once stood alone after a difficult morning, staring through the wire until Mercer quietly sent Atlas to sit beside him. Again, the dog touched Caleb's hand. Again, Caleb found it closed. "What are you showing me?" he whispered. Atlas continued to a patch of bare earth beneath the observation tower and stopped for the third time. He did not dig. He did not bark. He only looked at Caleb's hand, then lifted his eyes toward the platform above them. Caleb followed his gaze. Near the top railing, hidden beneath years of dust, Something small caught the last light of the sun and flashed silver. Caleb narrowed his eyes and stepped beneath the tower. The silver flash came again, faint but deliberate, from the underside of the upper railing. Atlas remained beside him, calm now, as if the path had brought them exactly where it was meant to. The tower rose about 20 feet above the field, its wooden stairs gray from sun and weather, each step edged with dust. Caleb placed one boot on the first stair, then paused. The structure had been closed for months. A small sign hung crooked from the rail, its red letters faded almost white. Authorized personnel only. Mercer would have laughed at the irony. Caleb could almost hear his voice telling him that rules mattered, but timing mattered more. Stay, Caleb said. Atlas said at once. The obedience should have reassured him. Instead, it made the earlier refusals feel even more intentional. Caleb climbed slowly, one hand on the railing. The wood creaked beneath his weight. From halfway up, he could see the entire training field behind him. The folded chairs were gone. The parking lot stood nearly empty. Long shadows stretched across the lanes, and the red flag at the far end barely moved in the wind. Atlas looked small below, but his gaze never left Caleb. At the top platform, the air felt cooler. Dust had gathered along the floorboards, disturbed only by a few bird tracks near the corner. Caleb moved toward the railing where the light had caught something metallic. A silver whistle hung from a short leather cord looped around a nail beneath the rail. It was tarnished, scratched, and unmistakable. Mercer's whistle. Caleb reached for it, then stopped before touching it. He remembered the last morning Mercer had worn it. The older Marine had stood at the center of the field with coffee in one hand and the whistle resting against his chest. He had corrected Caleb's posture, praised Atlas for ignoring a distraction, and ended the session early because the wind was turning cold. Nothing about that morning had felt final. That was the cruelty of ordinary moments. They rarely announced which ones would become sacred. Caleb lifted the whistle from the nail. It was heavier than he remembered. Beneath it, carved into the wood, were two letters separated by a small mark. CR. Then, farther to the right, an A. Caleb ran his thumb over the grooves. The cuts were shallow but careful. Below them was one word. Final. What did you do, Mercer? Caleb whispered. A sound rose from below. Atlas had not barked. He gave a single low huff, then looked toward the ground beneath the tower. Caleb followed the line of his gaze and noticed something else. The patch of bare earth where Atlas had stopped was not random. From above, 3 flat stones formed a narrow triangle around it. One stone pointed toward the bench, one toward the fence, the last toward the stairs. The 3 places Atlas had chosen were connected, not by Mercer's scent, but by Caleb's own history. The bench where his hand first began to shake after a sleepless night. The fence where he had stood apart from everyone after hearing news from his former unit. The ground below the tower where Mercer once found him sitting alone before dawn, with Atlas pressed quietly against his side. Caleb closed his fingers around the whistle. Atlas had not brought him here to recover a lost object. The dog had been marking moments. Caleb's moments. His right hand tightened again, this time around the leather cord. Below, Atlas rose and placed one paw on the first stair. Then he looked up, waiting. Caleb understood the message before he understood the reason. The lesson was not hidden in the field. It was hidden in him. Caleb descended the tower with the whistle closed inside his palm. Atlas stepped back from the stairs and waited until both of Caleb's boots touched the ground. For one quiet second, neither of them moved. The field had darkened around them. The last warmth of sunset rested along the horizon, while the first cool breath of evening slipped through the grass. Caleb looked from the whistle to the 3 stones beneath the tower. The pattern was too careful to be an accident. Mercer had planned this. Atlas had remembered it. And Caleb, for all his training, had missed what had been placed directly in front of him. A vehicle turned through the main gate, its headlights sweeping across the distant fence. The transport officer had returned. Caleb heard the engine idle near the parking lot, then the sound of a door opening. "Row," a voice called. "We need the dog loaded now." Caleb's shoulders stiffened. Atlas looked toward the voice, then back at Caleb. The moment tightened between them. Caleb could feel the old instinct rising inside him, the need to make the clean decision, the disciplined decision, the one that asked nothing from anyone. He clipped the lead shorter and began walking toward the parking lot. "Come on," he said. Atlas followed for 6 steps. At the edge of lane 7, the German shepherd stopped. Caleb kept moving until the lead drew taut. Atlas, heel. Atlas lowered his body to the ground. His chest pressed into the dust. His ears angled back, but his eyes never left Caleb's face. The transport officer approached, a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. What is going on? He is overstimulated, Caleb said, though the words sounded false the moment he spoke them. Long day. The officer reached for the lead. Atlas did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply shifted his weight closer to Caleb's boots. I have him, the officer said. Caleb hesitated, then handed over the lead. Atlas rose only when Caleb gave the command. He walked toward the transport van with slow, measured steps, glancing back after every few feet. Caleb remained beside the lane entrance, the whistle cutting into his palm. The rear door opened. Atlas climbed inside. Before the door closed, he placed one paw against the metal floor and scraped 3 times. Pause. Then once more. Caleb stopped breathing. 3. Pause. 1. Mercer's emergency return code. Return to the last safe point. The door shut. The van began to move. Caleb stared after it as the taillights rolled toward the gate. Something inside him broke free of discipline and became truth. Stop the vehicle. The officer beside him turned. Caleb was already running. His boots struck the pavement hard, and the whistle swung from his hand as he crossed the parking lot. Stop the vehicle. The van slowed near the gate. Caleb reached it, breathing hard, and pulled open the rear door. Atlas stood inside, waiting. Not frightened. Not confused. Waiting. Caleb took the lead from the handler and looked into the dog's amber eyes. You are not finished, he whispered. Atlas stepped down and turned toward lane 7 without hesitation. Caleb followed him back across the empty field as the first drops of rain touched the dust. This time, Atlas did not stop beneath the tower. He placed one paw on the bottom stair, looked over his shoulder, and began to climb. Atlas climbed the stairs with careful confidence, placing each paw near the center of the weathered boards. Caleb followed close behind, one hand on the railing and the silver whistle hanging from his other fist. Rain touched the tower in soft, scattered taps, darkening the wood one drop at a time. By the time they reached the upper platform, the field below had turned gray beneath the evening sky. The lights near the kennels glowed through the mist, distant and pale, while lane 7 disappeared into shadow. Atlas moved past Caleb and stopped beside the section of railing where the letters had been carved. He lowered his nose to the floor, inhaled, then pressed one paw against a narrow board near the corner. The board shifted with a dull wooden click. Caleb crouched beside him. Dust had gathered along the seam, but one edge showed faint scratches, as if it had been lifted before. He worked his fingers beneath it and pulled. The board rose slowly, releasing the dry scent of old wood and canvas. Inside the shallow space rested a small metal case wrapped in a faded green cloth. Caleb recognized the cloth immediately. It had once covered Mercer's field radio during training exercises. His name was still written across one corner in black marker, softened by time. Caleb set the case on the floor. Atlas sat beside him, close enough that his shoulder touched Caleb's arm. The latch opened easily. Inside was a compact voice recorder, a sealed envelope, and a photograph curled at the edges. Caleb picked up the photograph first. It showed him standing beside Mercer during Atlas's first month of training. Caleb looked tired and guarded. Mercer wore the patient half-smile he used whenever Caleb was pretending not to need help. Atlas sat between them, much younger, one ear still leaning slightly to the side. On the back, Mercer had written 5 words. He already knows when you leave. Caleb read them twice. Rain whispered against the roof. He reached for the recorder and pressed the power button. For several seconds, there was only static. Then Mercer's voice filled the small platform, warm, steady, and unmistakable. Caleb, if you are hearing this, Atlas brought you here. Caleb closed his eyes. The voice continued. That means he learned the return pattern. It also means you tried to walk away before he was ready to let you. Atlas rested his chin on Caleb's knee. You always believed the work was about making him stronger, Mercer said. You were wrong about that. Atlas was strong before either of us met him. The work was teaching him how to recognize the moments when you disappear without moving. Caleb's hand tightened around the recorder. Mercer began listing the signs. The closed right fist. The silence after a crowded room. The way Caleb stepped away after any moment that felt too good to keep. He notices all of it, Mercer said. Not because he is trained to judge you, because he is trained to stay. The recording paused, leaving only Rain and Caleb's breathing. Then Mercer spoke again, softer now. Atlas passed his final lesson months ago. The question was whether you would pass yours. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd beside him. Atlas lifted his eyes, but did not move. A Marine knows how to carry weight, Mercer said. But healing starts when he stops calling every burden his alone. The recorder clicked off. Caleb remained on the floor, unable to speak. The hidden compartment, the whistle, the return pattern, and every quiet touch against his hand now formed one clear truth. Atlas had not been trying to protect the field, the memory, or the past. He had been protecting Caleb from the habit of leaving before anyone could ask him to stay. For a long time, Caleb listened to the rain move across the roof in a soft, steady rhythm. Atlas remained beside him, his weight warm against Caleb's leg, asking for nothing. The recorder lay silent in Caleb's hand, but Mercer's words stayed in the air. Caleb had spent years believing control was the same as strength. He had learned how to stand straight when he was tired, how to answer clearly when his thoughts felt far away, how to leave a room before anyone noticed his hands begin to close. He had become skilled at disappearing without taking a single step. Atlas had noticed anyway. Caleb looked at his right hand. The fingers were curled tight around the recorder. Slowly, he opened them. Atlas lifted his head and touched his nose to Caleb's palm. The gesture was small, almost ordinary, but it carried the weight of every morning the dog had sat beside him in silence, every crowded hallway where Atlas had leaned gently against his knee, every night Caleb had remained awake while Atlas rested near the door. None of those moments had been accidents. Mercer had trained Atlas to see the warning signs, but the loyalty had become something deeper than training. You knew, Caleb whispered. His voice sounded unfamiliar in the quiet. All this time you knew. Atlas held his gaze. Caleb reached into the metal case and removed the sealed envelope. His name was written across the front in Mercer's block lettering. The paper had yellowed slightly along the edges. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet and a copy of an evaluation form. The letter was brief. Mercer wrote that Atlas had completed every required task months ahead of schedule, but his most important ability could not be measured by speed, obedience, or scent work. Atlas recognized Caleb's withdrawal before anyone else did. He interrupted it without force. He stayed close without making Caleb feel watched. Mercer believed that made Atlas more than a working dog. It made him the right partner for a Marine who had forgotten how to accept one. Caleb read the next line twice. I recommended permanent placement with you, but only if you choose it honestly. Beneath the letter was the evaluation form, signed by Mercer and approved by the base behavioral health coordinator. The recommendation had never reached Caleb's final packet. A note at the bottom explained why. The placement required Caleb to acknowledge that he needed continued support. No commander could make that admission for him. No trainer could sign it in his place. Atlas could lead him back to the decision, but Caleb had to take the final step. Rainwater drifted through the open side of the tower and darkened the floor near his boot. Caleb looked out across the field. From above, Lane 7 no longer appeared abandoned. The old posts formed a clear path back toward the main building, each one standing where Mercer had left it. Caleb understood now why the return pattern ended at the tower. It was not a command for the dog to come home. It was a reminder for the handler to stop running from it. I thought letting you go was the responsible thing, Caleb said. Atlas's ears shifted toward him. Maybe I was just afraid to ask you to stay. The German shepherd rose and placed both front paws gently across Caleb's legs, bringing his face level with Caleb's chest. Caleb rested his forehead against Atlas's head. His breath trembled once, then steadied. There were no speeches left to hide behind. No orders. No clean explanation. Only the truth. I need you, Atlas. The words were quiet, but they changed the shape of the room. Atlas exhaled and settled closer, as if he had been waiting months to hear them. Caleb folded the evaluation form and placed it inside his jacket. Then he stood, clipped the whistle beside his dog tags, and looked toward the administration building glowing beyond the rain. For the first time that evening, Atlas moved toward the stairs without looking back. Caleb followed. They descended the tower into a steady rain that silvered the field and softened the dust beneath their steps. Atlas moved beside Caleb without tension now, his shoulder brushing Caleb's leg as they crossed lane 7 toward the administration building. The whistle rested against Caleb's dog tags, giving a small metallic tap with every stride. It sounded less like a signal and more like a memory keeping pace. The building windows glowed warm against the darkening base. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over quiet hallways and framed photographs of graduating classes lined the walls. Caleb paused outside the duty office. Through the glass, Captain Harris sat behind a desk reviewing transfer forms. The transport officer stood nearby, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his jacket. Caleb's hand moved toward the door, then stopped. Atlas sat at his left side. The dog looked forward, calm and certain. Caleb felt the old instinct return, the one that told him to step away, return the paperwork, and avoid explaining anything that might make him seem less capable. His right hand began to close. Atlas leaned against his knee. Caleb opened his fingers and pushed the door. Captain Harris looked up. "Row, I thought the transport had already left." "It did, sir. I brought Atlas back." Harris studied the wet dog, then the whistle hanging beside Caleb's dog tags. Recognition crossed his face, followed by something quieter. "Where did you find that?" "Lane 7. Caleb placed Mercer's letter and the evaluation form on the desk. There was a compartment in the observation tower. The room fell still except for the rain ticking against the windows. Harris read the first page, then the second. His expression changed as he reached Mercer's signature. "I remember this recommendation," he said. "It was never completed. Because I never completed my part." Caleb's voice remained steady, though his heartbeat felt loud in his chest. Harris leaned back. "Do you understand what permanent placement means?" "Continued evaluations. Behavioral health appointments. A formal support plan. This is not simply keeping the dog because you have grown attached." Caleb looked down at Atlas. Water clung to the edges of the German shepherd's sable coat. His amber eyes remained fixed on Caleb, patient as they had been all evening. "Yes, sir. And you are willing to state, on record, that you need that support?" The question landed harder than any command Caleb had received in years. The transport officer shifted near the wall. Caleb could feel every habit inside him searching for a safer answer. Something careful, something temporary. But Mercer's voice returned to him. "Healing starts when he stops calling every burden his alone." Caleb placed both hands flat on the desk. "I need my dog, sir." No one moved. The words did not weaken him. They did not strip away his rank, his training, or the years he had spent serving others. They simply made room for the truth. Captain Harris looked at Atlas, then back at the form. He reached for a pen. "Then sign here." Caleb signed his name beneath Mercer's recommendation. The ink spread slightly where a drop of rain had fallen from his sleeve. Harris added his own signature and stamped the page. "The transfer is suspended effective immediately. Atlas remains assigned to you, pending final review." Caleb released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Atlas rose, placed one paw lightly against Caleb's boot, and gave a quiet huff. Harris glanced at the dog. Looks like he already knew the outcome. Caleb lowered a hand to Atlas's neck. He knew the choice. Outside, the rain began to ease. Caleb and Atlas stepped back into the night together, carrying the signed papers beneath Caleb's jacket. Behind them, the office lights remained bright. Ahead, the empty field waited beneath a clearing sky. By morning, the storm had passed. A thin mist rested over the training grounds, and sunlight touched the wet rails of Lane 7 until every drop shone like glass. The base was quieter than usual. No families waited near the fence. No rows of folding chairs filled the field. Only 4 figures stood beside the first wooden marker: Caleb, Atlas, Captain Harris, and the behavioral health coordinator who had approved Mercer's original recommendation. A 5th place had been left open. Someone had carried Mercer's old training chair from storage and set it near the lane, facing the course. On the seat rested his faded green cap. Caleb stopped when he saw it. For a moment, the morning seemed to hold its breath. Atlas approached the chair, lowered his nose to the cap, and remained there in silence. Then he returned to Caleb's side. Captain Harris held a small folder beneath one arm. "This is not an official graduation ceremony," he said. "The official one happened yesterday." His eyes moved toward Atlas. "But it appears one part was unfinished." Caleb looked across the field. The grass was still bent where they had walked through the rain. The old lane no longer felt abandoned. It felt remembered. Harris opened the folder and handed Caleb a new assignment order. Atlas would remain with him through a permanent support partnership, with continued training and regular evaluations. Caleb read the page slowly. His name appeared beside Atlas's, not as handler and equipment, but as partners. The distinction was only one word on paper. It felt like a door opening. The coordinator offered Caleb a simple nod. There was no pity in it, only respect. Caleb folded the order and placed it inside his jacket. Then he removed the silver graduation tag from his pocket. It was the same tag Atlas had worn the day before, polished clean now, the edges catching the early light. Caleb knelt beside him. "You earned this twice," he said. Atlas watched as Caleb fastened it to his collar. The tag settled beneath his chin with a quiet click. Harris stepped back. No one applauded. Somehow, applause would have made the moment smaller. Caleb rose and faced lane 7. He expected Atlas to look toward the course again, perhaps waiting for another signal, another hidden path. Instead, the German shepherd turned toward the main gate. He took several steps, then paused beside Mercer's empty chair. Atlas looked at it once. The breeze lifted the edge of the old cap. Caleb touched the whistle resting beside his dog tags. Metal met metal with a soft, clear sound. Atlas's ears moved toward it. Caleb placed one hand on the back of the chair, not to hold on, but to say goodbye. "We got the message," he whispered. He stepped away. Atlas fell into position at his left side, close enough that their shadows joined on the wet ground. Together they walked across the field, past the folded obstacles, past the fence where Caleb had once stood alone, and through the gate he had nearly left without his dog. Atlas did not need to look back again. Neither did Caleb. Behind them, the sunlight reached the empty chair and warmed the worn green cap. Ahead, 2 sets of footprints crossed the damp earth in the same direction. Atlas had learned how to find the man who disappeared without moving. Caleb had learned something harder. He had learned to remain where love could find him.